Well, clearly Thomas brought us together for a reason, and this is a very juicy topic for me as well. Yeah.
I took the liberty to start streaming because, or to recording, because I think, as you say, starts getting juicy very quickly. Um, and I really look forward to going deeper into that, which we surely will in this conversation. But why don't you go into your life, Andrew, a little bit, and show us how you configured, uh, uh, so it doesn't become unnatural. So you don't have to repeat that twice,
Sure.
um, and then we just take it from there. And
So
sorry to interrupt you. One last word. We will not publish this without your consent. And we will only look at this internally to make sense and find out the most important pieces of that conversation, and maybe invite you into a follow-up conversation where we deepen some stuff. So it's going to stay private.
thank you for that. So a little about my makeup and how this instrument called Andrew ends up getting used in some way, whether meaningful or not, we'll find out. Um, so going back to the inquiry that you were sharing, Lars, is it just occurred to me at a pretty young age that the way the world was designed, and an education system was the first real like experience of it for me. I was just like, this doesn't make any sense. Like, there's something that just is fundamentally backwards about of this design. It's like the insanity. It just felt like such insanity to me. And that was particularly around watching talented people pursue careers based in fear, based in parent pressure, based in wanting ego status. And clearly they weren't either good at it or aligned to it, or, and then actually doing some research and realizing that, oh, actually over 70% of people are miserable in their work and not productive. And then you go deeper into the statistics and you realize it's even worse. And then you start realizing that the environment is also being trashed by the very companies that people are being lured to work at as the successful, cool Fortune 500 type companies. And so my kind of view of the school system, particularly higher education system, is like some version of insanity, then led me to realize, well, the corporate world is actually an even deeper version of that insanity that's interconnected with the university system, which it's recruiting the top talent from. So these creative, bright sparks of passion and capacity get lured into some of the most destructive companies on our planet with, the carrot and the stick, and they're working their way up, climbing the ladder, thinking they're going to make it. And it's all this trauma and conditioning in our world around our own lack of maybe confidence, you could say, in ourselves and in trust in life, that we're susceptible to this type of luring based in ego and status and power, and the things that don't really satisfy the soul, if anything, make the soul sick. So yeah, come my early 20s, it was just so clear that I wasn't going to participate in that system, and that I wanted to contribute to waking people up from that nightmare, that a lot of people saw as the dream, the American dream, the dream of that corner office at the big company that everybody knows. And but at first I had to really go through my own awakening, and I was very fortunate to get plugged into some incredible work. One of those bodies of work is the Pachamama Alliance. It put out a symposium called Awakening the Dreamer, and it's an amazing, they have a video-based version online now that in 2.5 hours just wakes people up. It just helps you see like society's complex, right? So it's like I was so curious. I was like, I wanted to understand how society works, but when you're in your early 20s, it's just like to wrap your mind around, like you just kind of go with the sheep. And so it took me getting engaged with some of that work and then finding Buckminster Fuller and some of these other luminaries to then just go, okay, I've got a grasp now at the design of society and the core problems that are perpetuating this design. And in knowing that, I can't look back. I need to give myself fully to supporting a regeneration or a revolution in the way that we are developing as a human species. So the last 15 years have been that. It's looked different every few years perhaps, but that's been the theme, is just like all in for, you could say, system change, but at the root of that, recognizing it's a shift in consciousness, and those two are quite interconnected. And I've primarily played in the role of, you could say, new economics or business, recognizing that I like to call it a game. So the game that we're collectively playing is producing behaviors and outcomes that are not ideal for all life. So how do you change the game? So it's not just about adding consciousness to capitalism. It's recognizing that, kind of through the lens of game theory, there's incentives and structures in which keeps us in a certain pattern of coordination. And until we actually change that, we just kind of stay in this same loop. And so that's been a real interest to me in terms of, you can awaken a human being, you can support the personal development, but if you haven't actually changed also the system, the game they're playing, it's kind of a race to the bottom. Their behaviors start mimicking the system that they're in. And so that's been a deep curiosity of like, you take people who are incredibly, you could say, awake, conscious, empathic, and how would you support those people in coordinating together to create the most incredible beauty for life? And I really believe that I believe we're at that moment, and blockchain has a big piece to play in that. And I'm all in for that experiment.
Wonderful. That gives me a great bridge to move over into our second question, because our assumption of how that might work is to give people opportunities to log out of society on a fundamental and holistic level. So they're log out their entire life, which means that their entire livelihood comes from something and somewhere else than before. Feel free to talk about distributed ledgers and all technology you want. For our context, we assume that there is a probability for a convergence of climate chaos, civilization collapse, solar flare, and some other interesting disaster that will that might even lead to technology in the way we know it right now going away. So just for the as a for sake of the exercise, we're trying to do this without technology, but this does not mean you're not allowed to bring technology in if you want to.
Uh-huh.
So, so the question is, how would you structure such a community that is able of logging itself out of the current model of society, with around 100 to 1,000 people, and maybe also leading towards a question of how does that look on a global scale? I think that's where something like distributed ledgers might come in handy, but I'll leave that up to you. So if you have questions around that, around the framing, let's discuss that. But otherwise, I'll just mute myself for a while now and let you riff.
Hmm. Well, first of all, I think the best people to ask that question to would be the first people, the Aboriginals who have lived that way for so long. And in many ways, modern humanity is like a parasite that has replicated and destroyed sacred land, used more than it replenishes, and they've sat being destroyed, devastated, um, in so many ways. And we're fortunate, I'd say, to still have some of these custodians here to learn from. And yes, there's generations of trauma and there's all sorts of issues in those communities. And yet there's also a wisdom, a worldview that understands natural laws and rhythms and how to relate with each other and this existence that we're in. So I would say, first of all, inviting in that wisdom would be would be powerful and necessary. I'm on the board of an organization that works with tribes in Ecuador, and have a long time been very connected with Aboriginal wisdom and do my best always to learn. And so one thing that stands out for me is the appreciation for wisdom. And in our current culture, those who have power often are the sickest, right? They're the sociopaths that can build a for-profit company faster and beat out all these others and play sketchy games to win. So then you have these power dynamics that exist that is part of the destruction, part of the insanity. So one of the things I would say would be essential is where there is power, there is wisdom. There's a cultural respect for wisdom and a humility that wisdom is something that you gain through life experience. I think the Chinese are an interesting culture to look at. They show far more appreciation for family, far more appreciation for elders than the Western world. And I think there's really something to be said around that. So first and foremost, I'm getting right to like culture. I think a lot of these issues will stem from the culture being off. And you could say anything that's built by these groups living wherever they're living will just be a reflection of whatever the culture is, whatever is the fabric of the human connection and the worldview that prioritizes certain values. So if the culture is solid and based in wisdom and aligned with natural principles, then I think there's a chance to build something that can be an expression of that can be quite interesting and successful and resilient to all the things that are likely to come, as you mentioned, Thomas. And I one of my questions would be like, okay, well, who are the types of people that we're bringing together? And I think that will really dictate what the approach is. So if we take a bunch of Westerners, let's say, let's say we take a bunch of Americans, right? So here you have a culture that's very individualistic, that has a certain kind of set of cultural traumas and ways of being, and you put them in a crisis situation. I mean, the pandemic is revealing this, right? So what do you see in America right now is you see a lot of division, a lot of separation. A lot of people have found what is right and what is wrong, and those groups are now opposing, whether it's the Democrats and the Republicans, or whether it's the mask wearers and the anti-mask wearers. And so this, I would say, maturing ego, this ego that hasn't been humbled in face of uncertainty, it scrambles for knowing. It scrambles. It can't handle that level of uncertainty or that complexity, so it wants to grab on to certainty and control at some level, right? Because it fears its own death. It fears the unknown. And so if you were starting with a group of those people, I would say, one of the essential conditions would be probably some level of healing, trauma release, a lot of group coherence work, given there's a lot of like independent attitudes. How do you move from just like your self-interest to supporting the collective well-being, not losing your sovereignty necessarily, but like still keeping your sovereignty, but aligning to the collective good. And that, I would say, in most of these types of situations, is probably going to be the Achilles heel, like the hardest challenge to solve it at day one.
I would build on that, and say that's probably the only scenario where you don't have to go through this is a scenario where you are confronted with people who already have done this. Meaning, even if you have a mixture of people, like you have a bunch of original people, you have a bunch of Western, and then some Asians, imagining you're building this in Australia. You'd have to integrate these very different perspectives. So you would have to go through something similar. I would guess. I don't know. You said something very specific about how to a condition for the ego to be able to do that. You said humbled. And you're connecting that to the necessary preconditions for a healthy culture. So I'd like to go deeper into how does that humbling work on a if not on a cultural perspective. So not is there something that works across cultures in terms of humbling the ego? And then once you have done that, how do you go about forming the culture for that community? How does that happen?
Big questions.
Yes, that's why we're here.
So great questions. So first question around how does the humbling work? What could that process look like? And then how could that work like not just individually, but for like the culture, is that right? For the culture, the form based in that?
Yeah, how I heard you was that humbling is a necessary precondition for building the culture. So that's the ego takes a step back. That's what I heard. As a necessary precondition for the culture. It doesn't maybe it doesn't mean that you do the same process on a collective level. Maybe something else emerges out of that. But I think these are two separate questions. One is how do you help people to step out of their ego, or to get, humble their ego, and then once you've achieved that for everyone, how do you build the culture, or how do you nurture the culture that emerges out of that collective?
Yeah. So ego is a bit of a loaded word, and it can mean different things to different people. So, another way of framing it would be like there's the lowercase self and the uppercase self. So like in India, they often call it the Dwij, the second birth, the birth of your consciousness, where you realize you're a spirit, a soul. You're not just this identity, right? So for me, what I would perceive as things that stoke the ego or keep the ego really in control or susceptible to being out of harmony with the whole are things like power. So the ego wants to be in power, wants to be in control, which obviously when you're looking at like creating a culture with more coherence, that's could be a real issue if somebody's sneakily trying to like grab more control and power to kind of out of their own self-interest. Other things would be like any things that are like stoking the senses. So the sensory stimulation, satisfaction, addictions, or are all a form of ego like manifestation. So I'd say one, I mean, this is what ashrams do, and you go train with the Shaolin Knights. I mean, they all have environments that are designed to not tempt the ego, right? You're often not drinking anything stimulating, eating anything stimulating, you're not having sex, you're not around women if you're a man. Like they've figured out over thousands of years how to create these wombs to birth consciousness. And so I would say learning from those thousands of years of wisdom is to say, well, what are the ingredients to create a womb like this that consistently births somebody's awakening, bursts them into a more humble recognition that there's other kind of spiritual principles at work. And of course, I'm sharing this all from my worldview and life experience. So, take it for whatever it's worth.
That's what we're asking for.
But in my experience of life, that is that on the other side of all of that ego temptation is peace beyond words. There's a sense of peace and magic, a way that life actually just coordinates itself through you and around you, that it becomes so beautiful and effortless. And so in that you want that for your fellow brothers and sisters, and so, but before that, it's often that ego trying to control and force things together. It knows the right thing to do for the world and it's going to change the world in this way because in its righteousness, it knows it's best for everybody. And so all of that energy, and that particularly can be very tricky with like groups that are doing things that actually seem like they're really good. I mean, so you could easily end up with people that like you read their bio and you're like, wow, this person's doing a lot of good things. They check the boxes and all the kind of like progressive work in the world. But if it's the more of that progressive work becomes cool, the more the ego is just like attracted to it and liking the limelight from it. And so it becomes even trickier in a way to have the discernment around what does it really take to create the type of womb or to create the right kind of like fertile soil for a different type of energy to come through us that's truly transformational. And I often feel in these groups or conferences or things I go to is like we're talking about the change we want to see in the world, and yet we're more like moving deck chairs around on the Titanic, right? And so we're using the same tools and we're just rearranging them, and yet the quantum shift that actually is required is it's an inner shift. It's a different quality of energy. It's different ingredients actually that come together to create something new, and we need to become those ingredients, right? And so that's kind of what I speak to on the level of ego is I think people need to be truly, genuinely willing to participate in something like this. Like in that moment of their life, they're saying, this is a yes to me. They're not being coerced or forced. They're on their own will saying, I'm ready for this type of adventure. And this adventure requires a level of surrender and transformation and transparency and humility that is just part of the journey. And so yeah, I would say in recap, what are the conditions that create the womb for awakening? Two, how do you discern who's truly in their own heart and soul, like called to that. So you're not like forcing people in, but it's like people are being attracted in and are really signing up for that and willing. There's a willingness. Um, and yeah, and then I would say three is um, is just recognizing that this type of transformation can actually take a lot of time, or can be instant, but it's it's not to be produced, right? It's more like to be discovered in yourself, and there's like a level of acceptance in that, right? So it's like with a project that's doing this type of work, you could want it to have a outcome of XYZ, but I think you also have to kind of surrender that outcome and just be with what happens, be with what's true, be with what emerges. And that's actually part of what's required, to not force something that's actually just not wanting to be.
Okay. As I'm building this mental image of that group of people, I see 100 people who, for some reason, got together somewhere, and they're now engaging in this work, on their on themselves in some sort of womb situations, and as you're doing this, you're already defining part of the culture, and now some of those people might emerge and it just doesn't fit, and that's where it becomes more tricky for the community. Um, how do you, in very concrete terms, say goodbye to those people or integrate them in a different way? How do you maybe don't say goodbye to them and welcome that diversity in, which you will have to do along the way anyway, because new people will be born in, new people will come your way, and so that's crossing over to the culture question, saying, okay, what are the things we need to do to make this, to move this beyond a conscious community of people who on the surface of it at least are like-minded, and then over the course of a year or two or three, all of the difficulties emerge. How do we integrate those difficulties culturally so that can has the potential at least to last for decades?
So I have a question for clarity, because I feel like there's a couple tracks we could go on. One track is a group of 100 people just show up together somewhere, right? So there's no curation, it's just a matter of how do you survive and do your best. There's another track that's more in the direction of there's an initial intention to create a regenerative expression of community that supports all life. And therefore, on the front end of it, there's a bit of a recruiting discernment process. What track do you think we should go down with this conversation?
Lars, you unmuted yourself. Do you have a response?
I'm just something that we are talking about here is the core of something really powerful and interesting, is that you said in the beginning this about that you could go through a process, a very rapid process, and it was hugely transformational in regard to your enlightenment or understanding who you truly are. One of the experiments that I formed a business school in Norway, an alternative business school, and one of the biggest experiments we have been doing for like 14 years is that we take a group of young people into an island, take their mobile phones, everything away from them, And first we do 24 hours where they are totally exhausted. And then for 4 days, they are basically in this room having conversations about who they are.
Mm.
And this work is supported by a lot of theory and Yalom and others. And what happens is a natural healing process into the goodness of human nature. What has been one of the really big discoveries is that human nature is truly good. And I really admire this book about humankind that shows that a lot of the stories we have about that human nature is actually evil and so is not true.
Mm.
And what is truly interesting is that when people come together in that kind of climate and the settings are right, they start to really, really support each other in a really fundamental way. And they discover that we all have the same kind of wounds and whatever. And talking about it and addressing it and just take it out and looking at it and formulate that we could choose another path. It's truly empowering, and you can really do it in a surprisingly short period. Just you take all the things away that is normally in everyday life. So, of course, we can put 100 people together, but there's something really interesting about how can we prototype, create these kind of environments that liberate people so we can make it into a mass movement. That's one line, as I understand what you say. That is truly interesting. And then there's this about building community, taking people together, but they are linked. I don't think the second process will succeed if you are not having a model for the first.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, more or less what you just shared too. I think it's really beautiful just to imagine, young people getting together and going through it's like a collective struggle
Yeah.
is such a meaningful way to bring people together. I mean, the virus in a way is doing this for us. And to know at that place that the best of humanity can actually come out just assuming it's the other way, I think is a really powerful way of looking at it. And I would say that there's also how do you frame this, psychological conditions that create narcissism or even sociopaths. And so even in some of these groups, I think it's important to recognize, not to like shun those people and say, well, they're demonize them, but to recognize that some of these energies are present. There's actually a decent percentage of humanity that have certain type of patterning, and that we've done a really poor job of a human species in really nurturing those people and not just kind of giving them the keys to the castle. And so, which then keeps them even more stuck in the trauma. And so I think it is true that there are certain ways of bringing people together that just absolutely brings out the best, and that we can just trust the process. and that there's another nuance to it, in that that to also not be, I think, naive to those that in a really cunning way will grab power or not feel empathy towards others and potentially use that in harmful ways. And so the inquiry then becomes, well, like, how do you handle that? Like a lot of trauma healing shows it's not actually effective on people with these types of like the DSM-5 kind of disorders, right? And so that's been a deep one for me, and I can't say I have the answer to it, but I think in group context, it's just really important to be aware of, because when people are most vulnerable, they're also most susceptible to manipulation, and these are where cult-like dynamics form, and what can seem like an amazing culture forming can very quickly spin into a charismatic leader or some sort of weird dynamic.
I just want to step one back and answer your questions, although they have been implicitly almost both been answered. So to the question one, the type of group, you refer to there's a certain percentage of different mental states, let's call them that, in any population. So it really, to my mind, it really does not matter. Life is messy always. Whether you put together 120-year-old Westerners or you randomly pick people from all over the globe, you will end up with roughly the same messiness. It might have a different direction, but it's going to be messy in both cases. So to me, it really does not matter that much where the people come from, what kind of people, and not even their motivation, because if you're a group of people somewhere in the outback, there's no choice but being regenerative. Right?
It's interesting, Thomas, and just one point that connected to some of the things you said, Andrew, that I think is really, really important here is that in any space you invite people into, there's some kind of design. Like this space is you sail the students out to an island, they're totally isolated. I have a background as a Buddhist monk as well. So there's some energy into there. You talked about wisdom and at a deep level, be able to handle whatever comes up in these people and facilitate it in, I think, in a good way. So there's also something about we can create a random room, but there's also about how we can create these rooms in a way that they are truly healing and empowering, right?
Yeah. The analogy that comes to mind is like cancer, right? Where there's a certain kind of set of, if there's enough healthy cells, you can introduce an unhealthy cell and it handles it just fine, right? But if you don't have enough healthy cells, that the one healthy cell can quickly take over the whole thing and spread the disease. And so there's something to that I think is important to consider. And I love what you're saying, Thomas, is like, it doesn't really matter. It's like, it's always going to be messy. Things are going to change. It should be emergent and like embrace the complexity and the diversity. And I would say though, that it's a very different thing if people are opting in for a certain experiment, or if they're just randomly showing up with completely different worldviews. Like where you would start, I think, would be very different for those two groups.
Can you sketch out? We don't have to go into this deeply, maybe, but can you sketch out how you would see that difference between those two groups of people?
So I would say the ones that are willing to like opt in for a specific type of experiment, you're enabling a level of coherence right out of the gate. So if you look just through the lens of like a developmental lens, like all these frameworks are kind of limited, but like if you took like a integral model, right, and said, okay, we're asking certain questions to get a sense of, are people tier 1, tier 2, or they developmentally at a place where they can handle complexity, they're not confused with the I versus the, you know, the broader self, so to speak, the more awake to universe. That would create a different group dynamic and different capacities. So for example, there would be a natural inclination in a group that would be, I'm using tier 2 in like spiral dynamics integral, right? So if they're tier 2, then you could sit in a group and practice some level of like collective sense making, collective intention, and just like listening and like receiving and sharing wisdom with nobody necessarily like grabbing the mic and saying, come with me, I'm convinced I got the right way, you guys are wrong, you know. And so you would see that happen more in a group of like with more tier 1 type energy, right?
Okay.
So
I just want to deepen that question a little bit. So let's assume you have a group of tier 2 people. so they have a certain, to use the meta-modern language, a certain mindset complexity. But does that equate to running a similar software on that complex mind? So you can have a very, very high level of consciousness, and if you run a certain software on that mind, then you can still be very exploitative. So that's how I understand it. So is that measure enough, measuring tier 2, or would you do something else?
Yeah, definitely more than that. I mean, there's all sorts of different developmental lines, right? So looking at tier 1, tier 2, what you could say is that's like one line. You'd probably want to look at a bunch of lines and create some level of curation process to say, if the objective intention of the community is to get to a state of resilience and regeneration before going extinct, and that there's a likely short window of time to be able to accomplish that goal, and if that was the orientation of the experiment, then I would say absolutely have a strong curation criteria that looks at different developmental lines that would be most important in this context. Know that once everybody comes together, it all kind of, you got to drop all of that, right? It just like, it's a bunch of humans together, but at least on the front end, you have actually ensured some level of coherence. You've created an agreement field that will also support the coherence.
Mm-hmm.
That agreement field enables an ability to have people leave more peacefully because those conditions were set up front.
Mm-hmm.
I've failed in those ways in past in group experiments where there wasn't a strong enough agreement field, and then there was actually very specifically a you could say a personality disorder, DSM-5 type thing that showed up. Getting that person to leave was nearly burnt down the whole initiative. Actually, in a way it did, because that their reaction, their ego got so triggered, they created a competitive initiative and then just attacked the thing that we were doing. And for me, that was a real powerful experience of even in the womb of like absolute grace and beauty, you do have some of these characters that if there isn't enough coherence to hold that energy and you ask them to leave, I mean, it's a recipe for being burnt down.
That's interesting, and let's explore that. So that agreement field, how is that articulated, and how is that? What happens to that? Does it evolve? How does it evolve? Let's talk about the agreement field.
Yeah, I mean, there's probably all sorts of ways of doing this, right? And
how would you do it? How would you do it?
I'd be very curious to tap into some native wisdom on it. For me personally, what seems to be most true is one, as part of the agreements, is to state that things will constantly change and emerge. And so there's like an honoring that we're all in a listening process together. So if you try to create too much structure up front, you can suffocate it and kill it from day one. So by its nature, create an agreement field that is actually alive with the group, that is changing and morphing, but giving enough structure that I think that enough structure actually allows, it's like, I get this analogy of like it's like if you're planting a garden, first you want the fertile soil, right? So that's kind of like the curation process. You're ensuring that there's like a fertile soil that comes together. And then in addition to the fertile soil, you want some structure. So then the little seeds can start growing up the vines, right? And then there's stability and there starts to be some sort of like formation happening. But essentially you want the garden to become a permaculture. You want it not to be a monocrop. You want it to have diversity, because in that diversity, it actually becomes resilient. So eventually you remove the stakes, and the plants are actually just interacting and spreading, and that permaculture is actually where the resilience is. But you don't get to that permaculture, you don't get to that complexity and diversity without the fertile soil and without that initial staking and structure support. So I think it's naive to just say, well, let's just throw a bunch of people together and expect to get this thriving, regenerative, diverse thing to happen. I think it's more likely that you end up with a bunch of weeds, a bunch of pesticide, like rodents, and the thing fails pretty fast.
But isn't it interesting if you take a group of, like, say, 1,000 people, and then we put them in society like it is today, and as you stated initially, Andrew, we have created this in a system that supports some of these dysfunctional characters, right?
Mm-hmm.
And we live in a society where there is a structure, there are some norms, there are some views, there are some support mechanisms, and somehow the ones who are dysfunctional in looking at what human nature possibility could be, they end up in power, as you said. So what we have created is a system that empower the wrong people.
Mm-hmm.
And what we are talking about here, can we create a system where we empower the good things in people? So it will be other values and other characters that will be the powerful. You said yourself, there should be a connection between power and wisdom, not power and greed or whatever. So what I take from what you're saying, it's there will always be something guiding a space, and it's basically what we would like to support and how we would like to support that we are talking about, isn't it?
Yeah. Very, very well recapped, Lars. And what comes to mind is the importance of actually making some of that explicit. So as part of that agreement field, you could even say it's a charter or it's a set of values that is like the North Star. And there's a honoring of that. Maybe it's even a co-creative process with the group. I mean, not that dissimilar to how companies actually create values that guide their organizations, but there's a certain level of charter that is sacred, that is like, it rules, and there's wisdom in that charter. I think that's an essential part of the agreement field. And I could speak to some of those things that I think would be important in a particular type of experiment like this, if you like.
Yeah, please do. That, and then maybe you can lead that also over in the possibility of adaptation field. Because the hard thing about living as a permaculture garden is some stuff is there to die. So some of the memes, some of the concepts have to go away. And how do you manage that as a culture?
Yeah. I mean, to that point, I think that would be part of the charter, so to speak, is that there's a honoring of the cycles of life and things that grow and things that die. And so it's like, as a worldview, as a fundamental part of culture, there's this appreciation for all the kind of cycles that might happen. And I think maybe there's even a design process here where it's to recognize, all right, we're transitioning, we're in a time between worlds. And so given that we've been raised in this world, let's call it world A, and we're in the time between, and we want to create world B, but we have to recognize that we were encultured by world A. So it's not that easy just to swap worldviews. So we have a really actually challenging task of, one, going through the birth canal ourselves hopefully being supported by wisdom, by indigenous peoples and those who actually have lived a more embodied experience of a different way to help guide and support. But then also to recognize that, like, as we go into supporting others coming in and building, let's say, something like a charter, that we do it in context to the world A type of programming that's going to come in. So what you're saying, Thomas, I think is brilliant, is like, yes, some people will have these memes and these ideas. Let's say they're really scared of just letting their thing go or letting something die. Well, we could kind of like preempt that in a way and say, okay, well, let's make sure that's elevated or really pronounced in the charter, because that's going to be one of the the susceptibilities to world A programming coming in and disrupting world B from being its pure expression. And kind of
based on
going
your
back,
based on your experience with yourself and with organizations you've been part of, what would you reckon is a healthy way and rhythm for these types of questions of what has to die and how does it die? Or does there need to be a rhythm? Does it just happen naturally? I don't know.
what do you mean by rhythm?
Sorry? Yeah.
What do you mean by like rhythm?
Well, if you look at a let's say the permaculture garden, let's use this metaphor. There will be some natural cycle that will create living or adverse conditions for some of the plants. So they will just not continue to live. And so they will integrate, and they will nurture the rest of the plants that way. And that is a cyclical thing. So I was just, maybe that was wrong, I don't know, using that metaphor for adaptation of the agreement field, so that there might be some cyclical nature to that too. But maybe it's not necessary. Maybe just there's something that that helps this group of people to manage this in a different way, in a non-cyclical way. I don't know. But
yeah, the cyclical nature is interesting. I don't feel strong either way in that. I don't know. It's just not clear for me if that's yeah, a piece to really lean into or not.
well, it's not important. It was just my idea.
Yeah.
I'd like to hear yours. Sorry, I interrupted you earlier.
So yeah, if we start getting into like some design criteria, right? I mean, I think the classic one is this like tragedy of the commons, which is how do you prioritize the common good while recognizing that people often choose self-interest, and actually creating a system, creating a game design in which people can follow their intrinsic motivation, which often you could frame as self-interest, less egoic self-interest, but like the call of their heart. So they're not limited by the design. They're actually, the design is actually liberating them to be more of who they are and to add beauty to the universe, right? How do you do that while ensuring the system actually continues to prioritize the common good for all life? And you could say America has been, was framed as the great experiment to liberate from like the tyranny of religious rule, like a certain worldview having power over law, and the Freemasons, really being the network that created the conditions for this kind of experiment to kind of come out of a nation based in liberty and freedom and independence. And I think what the big learning is from that experiment all these years later is that in a way it worked, and it got us out of some dark times, but in another way it allowed that like unconscious egoic individualism to yes, become successful for itself, but not in consideration to the whole. And as technology got more powerful, then the capacity to extract more from nature and to have more power over others actually created a similar type of tyranny than the one that was liberated from the age of religious rule. And so we're back in this similar type of challenge. And I think this go around, we need to really solve for how do you sustain individual freedom while having enough consciousness online so that there's also just an intrinsic care to consider all life impacted. And so I would say that that would be like the orientation of action should be towards collective, you could say like collective good, or you could say good's a weird word to use, but you could say what doesn't limit life and ideally adds beauty to it. That would be an orientation that would sustain and regenerate. And how does the system actually free people to just pursue their heart's call, to pursue whatever motive they feel in themselves, but to nurture them enough so that that motive isn't a power over others or power over the natural world, but one that it's true sovereignty, which true sovereignty for me is it's an ability to not be tempted by the senses or be tempted by being programmed by beliefs or other people's agendas, or be susceptible to all that, but to really just be so in tune with your own guidance, where you sense what is meaningful and it can act on it. So you can both clear the airwaves from all the noise, all the distractions, all the programming, get insight from some other source, receive that clearly within yourself, and then also have the courage and tools to act on it. And I think if enough people were nurtured in a culture to have that capacity to be sovereign in themselves, and then had I don't want to use the word business, a coordination system, a game that allowed them to sustain themselves and sustain their communities, by acting on those intrinsic desires, I would say that those are some of the really important conditions to get out of the dynamics we're in.
There are two ways to achieve this, and you've touched on both. But I'd like to explore how the incentive structure behind this has to be. If you, with full permission of the scope of this little conversation, put yourself in God view, right? And you could design this however you want. What would be the incentive structures? Because you built this on wisdom and self-actualization somehow being the gold standard, being the highest form of incentive. But neither of those are, at least at this point in time, in any way measurable. And by the coming from a world A socialized mind. So it's hard for me to imagine how that incentive structure could work. So if you put yourself into God mode, how would you create it?
So when we think about incentives, we have we have just a default way of looking at, like, oh, money. It's like, I will take this action if you give me that, right? And we forget that civilization has existed in ways that look very different from that. And in a way, the systems of like currency and money have created some freedom and created a lot of innovation in a built world. What I would like to see at this stage in humanity's development is where it's a give first way of being. So you don't act to get, you act because there's a joy in your being, or to contribute something. And there's a way in which others, out of the joy in their being, give to you in recognition of the beauty that you've contributed. Now, if we're trying to like really ground this here, like in the land of like tokenization, blockchain, one of the ideas I really love is this idea of like a gratitude token being distributed. So let's say that you're involved in a decentralized type project that has a token based design, and that there's every, let's say, quarter, a percentage of the success of that gets put into everybody's wallets in a specific type of token. Let's call it the gratitude token. And the thing with the gratitude token is you can't spend it yourself. The only thing you can do with it is to give it to others within the network. And so, and it's all transparent, right? The ledger's all transparent. So it can't be gamed, the system, because people could be like, I'll give you every month, we'll just trade, you know? It's like ungameable. It's all transparent. And so it's from the genuine like joy of like, well, Sally's having a hard time, you know, she's had a health issue. I just feel for her. I'm giving my contribution this month to Sally, or I'm giving it to Juan because Juan is like just crushing it. He built this beautiful art piece and I just want to hook Juan up, right? I think there's something so beautiful in the joy we get from giving, not just from what we create, but from actually just giving to others with a feeling of abundance. And the way we give to nonprofits these days is so often just dead. So it's so disconnected from a true human to human, like real connection. And so I'd say some level of the design involves a resource distribution that happens from like a really genuine place of gratitude and giving. And the other part of it is that some resources getting distributed enough so that's not getting too centralized. Like right now, you have all these billionaires. They're trying to give away their money, but from a very limited perspective, they often create more harm, and they'll be the first ones to admit it. And so some people like Sergey Brin say, I think maybe the best thing for me to do is to burn all my money. You know, and or you have Bezos's ex-wife. She's just giving them. So she kind of got educated in all this and said, I'm going to do it differently. I'm just going to find people who are good people, and I'm just going to give them the money. I don't have to see their organizations. We just need to move the money and trust the distributed intelligence of life to actually know what to do with it. So I think at some level of this design, resource needs to be widely distributed so you get more antennas of wisdom being able to act and distribute accordingly.
It sounds it sounds complex. It sounds somewhat doable on a distributed ledger. So we can definitely explore that or ideas around that. How would you do this with a messy group of 100 people?
Well, with the messy group of 100 people, I think you'd first want to be designing for resilience from power, like destructive power dynamics. So how would you create the design so that it's unlikely that a sociopathic leader like takes over the whole thing, or creates an in-group that then creates an out-group and creates an internal division and competition? I would say those dynamics would be first designed for that. And I mean, if you look at capitalism, it's kind of funny in a way. It's like it's perfectly designed for the opposite. Mm-hmm. So how, like, what are some of the simple shifts in that? I think one is well, I'm just going to use the world as we know now because it gives a little bit more context. So the world as we know now, if you're going to create a project, like how do you keep that project oriented towards the collective intention of that project, towards the purpose of that project?
Mm-hmm.
Well, there are things you can do in terms of how the project is governed, in terms of like legal ownership of things,
Mm-hmm.
how much power can get allocated to one person, and so I think like bringing some of those elements in would be pretty essential with a random group of 100 people.
Okay. Let's broaden the picture. So let's imagine there are many of these experiments all around the globe. 100 people, 1,000 people, 5,000 people, and tens of thousands or maybe hundreds of thousands of these types of communities. How do they interact? Do they interact?
Yeah, this is I literally was having this conversation this afternoon with a community-based project out here, and this just kind of like intuitive sensing of like, you know, at some point all these things connect, and there's this, right? It's just, we know it's happening. It's so how that actually is going to work in detail, I think, is up to the great mystery. I do feel technology is going to support it in a meaningful way.
Okay.
And I think it's something like an access token. I think we move from people owning the land to this recognition that like land isn't owned, it's actually just stewarded. And that, yeah, you can own buildings, you can increase the value of a building, but you we don't create these dynamics where basically property values go up in an area, and it basically prices out the local population that actually created the value that made it such a cool place in the first place, right? So we see this happening where I am in Byron Bay, and how do you prevent that happening over a long period of time? Well, you prevent the ability for people to speculate on real estate, which attracts that, you know, profit-oriented, maybe ego-minded person that is like, I'm going to squat on this. I don't really care if it affects the community, but I'm going to just see the appreciation and I'll flip it, you know? So if you're actually starting to talk about how you get into like a real estate structure and network communities, I think it looks actually very different from what we have right now in terms of ownership of property, or particularly ownership of land. And I think one of the synergizers between the communities and properties is some sort of access token that if you have a house in one, you can like kind of more effortlessly move through the system and use a house in another. And even in terms of governance, you know, a lot of these intentional communities, they start out with a good intention, and then, you know, years down the line, it's a bit of a mess. I think a lot of that has to do with the way ideologies change and power dynamics form within these communities, and the crunchy human dynamics of trying to like govern. I think if we actually used some technology that did a little bit more collective sense making, made it more effortless for people to participate in governance without needing like a full-time community. It's like a lot of these communities, it's just a taxing role to actually be navigating all the dynamics in the housing association. And I think they'll become far more efficient, far more effortless, far more actually distributed in their input and governance, and in a way allow us to do that in multiple locations, not just the physical location that we're based. And therefore what we start to see is, you know, I've sometimes framed it as like a borderless nation. It's like you're opting in to a society that exists beyond just one nation, but it has an economy, its own currencies, and its own type of governance of resource. And thanks to blockchain, we can do those types of things that we relied on governments for in the past. And we'll start to see like more, I think we'll go from these like nations where there's a lot of centralized control and currency economics and governance, and we'll see a lot more distribution. So we'll have all these like micro societies that go across borders and are like their own little economies.
And are independent, as you say, of my physical location. So I can be part of several of these distributed economies, which then makes it easier for me to change location if I want to. So in contrast to medieval Europe, every city had their own currency. So you had to basically enslave yourself if you went into a new city in order to get some of that currency. There was simply no other option. I mean, you might have had gold, but that's a rare case where you can do a transaction. But in any other case, you would have to enslave yourself first and then start building your life on top of that if you moved. And so you're by detaching that physical part of the economy from or your physical location from the economy, you allow for more flexibility.
Yeah.
But that begs the question: do people want that flexibility? I mean, you're hopping around the globe and you feel comfortable in many different cultures, but how many people really do? So there might be a so I noticed an underlying assumption about the idea of migrating as a potential solution for conflict in those communities. But what if people just want to stick around? They like that tree over there. They don't want to let go of that tree. They like these 3 people, but they hate these other 30. What if people just stick around, although life could be so much better somewhere else?
Absolutely. I think certain people have orientations to stay in one place more, just to be more rooted in the earth, and just I think that's very likely. And of course, this design would have to support something like that. I do think it's interesting though, if you look at ancient civilizations like the Mayans, their whole civilization was built as their sites were like universities, and so you moved between sites as you were kind of progressing through their kind of Mayan cosmic university. I mean, this is one view. Do we know for certain this is the case? I don't know. But what I learned about the Mayan civilization was that, and potentially this is the case in Egypt and other places. I know in Australia, Aboriginals here also moved around a lot, and they'd come to different places because the land had different energy. So this was a place of healing, and then you went to the place in this season because that's where the fish were. And so there's a role humanity was actually playing in connection with nature to help actually support its natural cycles and to be in harmony with those cycles. And moving around was actually part of that. So I do have a curiosity of, not that everybody has to be moving all the time, but that maybe a more fluid design is actually more natural than what we have now, and more supportive for actually our human development.
That is possible. But what if people don't like that? So there are several cultures around the globe that build floating houses. And these floating houses decay over the course of roughly 1 generation. So as you're building it, you have to rebuild it in 25 years or 20 years. Isn't there a natural tendency that to try and create this subjective stability, so you don't have to rebuild your house 2, 3, 4 times in your lifespan. And even with the knowledge that being tuned into this more natural cycle by allowing your house to break down, and then just building another one, even that knowledge might not prevent us from trying to build these more stable houses, just to use houses as an example.
Lars,
That's
I'm curious if you've been very quiet, if you have anything to share or add.
I'm just listening, and I'm just getting into a really deep mode of listening, because I notice the way that you speak, the way you take in the questions, close your eyes. It just brings me into resonating, trying to follow you. So I've acquired a little bit my own mind, trying to create counter questions. So I felt that very, very nourishing.
Beautiful. I mean, this is, I think, the ultimate way of discovering the answer to these questions, is that we're actually creating a collective field right here, and intentions are set, and we're all just receiving different signal that our own instruments have a certain different way of processing, right? So that's why I ask as well, is as we're all kind of sitting in this receptive field together, it's like, all right, what other wisdom's coming through and popping and wanting to add itself to the circle.
You said it beautiful in one sentence. That building really a new game in how we structure society is about listening. This ability to deeply listen into yourself and to other beings, and to the principles that should guide us. This ability have been lost in our culture to a large degree. And what was interesting in listening to you, which not happens that often, is I went into a meditative state of just started to feel your presence and your mind and your actually also your breath. And then I know then I'm really, really listening. And it only happens when I really resonate with the person talking.
Yeah, I feel that resonance with both of you. It's like a familiar feeling. It's like, all right, beautiful.
So from
We're
that collective mindset, if you should, instead of me mirroring what you have been said, if you should pose one question, Andrew, where we are in the conversation right now, what would be the question that comes up to your mind, and what is the most meaningful question? It's like we are at a place where you are curious. Okay, what is the question that is now emerging for us to explore? If I could ask it in that way instead.
Something around, what are we not seeing, or what assumption might we be making as we explore this innate call within us to be in community together in a different way. So we clearly are feeling this pulse of, we're going to go through this process, whether it's really soon or sometime in our life, where yes, maybe it's a very significant external event, solar flare, whatever, or even not, but there's a reorganization of community, and what bias, what assumptions, or what are we not seeing that would be helpful to bring into the explicit that would provide wisdom and guidance as we explore these topics?
One when you talk, one image that I have shared sometimes come into to mind. The way I have my summer vacation is 5 weeks with the three other families that are basically really old friends. And we are in this really beautiful place in very, very simple houses. There's a beautiful sea and a forest. And we are basically just present with the kids. And we have created a community where we do not have visitors and things like that, because we are into a state of flow with each other. And this conversation emerge from year to year, like start every morning like walking with these old friends for 1 hour and then just swimming naked in the sea. And these conversations have emerged over many, many years. And it creates a really peaceful place for the children, because everything is about being together, cooking together, playing together, and create some kind of harmony around the community and the children. And one very powerful experience was that there's 13 children in this band, and we often sit at campfires. And quite a lot of the children were around 7 years in this case, and I have sensed that there's a lot of fear in children that I haven't seen before, because they in school they have a lot about climate, they have plastic in the whales, there's so many things that fear them. When I was a child, we had this with nuclear war, of course, but now there's so many parameters, and I had this conversation with them over a night that really made me really, really silent inside. Is that they, when they were really deeply listened to, they described exactly how they see the reality. They don't understand how we pollute the forest. They don't understand why we cut down the trees. They don't understand why we parents live lives where we can't be more with them. They don't understand why they're put to school when they hate it. And then we talked about the solutions, and they all see extremely clearly what this is about. Mm. And then my ways of phrasing, and then we take these beautiful souls and put them to Harvard and other places, and they forget totally who they are.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Like one example, when doing student politics, my next in line in Denmark was, I think he graduated with the highest average in economics given in Denmark, and he became the advisor to both the prime minister and the financial department. And he was just such a brilliant visionary thinker and blah, blah, blah. And after 10 years as a civil servant in these systems, he can't think anymore. The first reaction to any really deep question is that, oh, that's not realistic.
I'd like to build on that with one question that often emerges for me out of those conversations, which is, how do we create an environment that rewards courageous exploration? So I notice in myself, although I'm really experienced in breaking societal norms, with how much pain, fear, and insecurity, uncertainty doing this comes every time. And so going into the unknown, and how do we create a situation where going into the unknown is a good thing? Because the opposite of that is what Lars is describing, is the assimilation and a crystallization of societal norms in all types of organizations and societal structures that then are hard to get out of.
Yeah. To synthesize both of your shares, it occurs to me that something we might not be seeing or bringing more explicit in at least this conversation is kids, and perhaps the most important thing to do is to design the community around what really supports the kids in being able to handle the unknown, in not being tempted to the big institutionalized universities, or not needing to do that type of thing to be successful in life. I'm like, what does this look like through the lens of raising just incredible kids that are, so it's like we're in the time between worlds, right? So we struggle with all of our conditioning and bias. And as we raise kids, how do we just raise kids in a way where we don't just transfer our trauma and bias, but really nurture them to be more stable in a different type of worldview and culture? And how does the community design actually really support that?
I think you're absolutely into something, because basically the reality we have is how we form people, right? And when we look at the kids growing up, how much of their time are they truly spent in a state of love and compassion, and how much time is spent in fear and in fear mode? And I think we are quite close to some really central here. Is what are the guiding principle behind all we are doing? Should it be fear or greed, or should it be love, compassion? It sounds so simple, and I think truly it is that simple.
Yeah.
Like the first time I met a recipe for life that were truly meaningful to me was at early in life, studying Buddhism quite hard. And it started with that the first thing in any training of mind is to have peace in your mind, which is why you start with morals. Be the person that you truly believe you should be, so you can live fully with yourself. You can't start truly to train your mind before you have that inner peace. And then when you have that concentration on top, then you can start to have insights that are true insights, that are connected to wisdom, instead of so it's very much about which stage you're thinking from.
Well said.
I just received a call from my best teacher, who's 11 years old, Noah.
Good timing.
And you know, this we sometimes use this image, seeing the world through a child's eyes. If you really truly do this, you will really see the world in a new light, and you can use every inquiry of a child, every why they ask, to as an opportunity to really question what we're doing here. And I had made a promise to myself that I'd always give Noah a proper answer. That would never say that's just because we do things like that around here, but always think it through as far as I can. Or if I can't, acknowledge that and tell him, I don't know, but if it's really important, we can try and find out. And doing that taught me probably more than anything else. It forced me to put concepts that were not, that I held implicitly, that I already knew, into words that were fit for a 4-year-old, and then a 5 or 6-year-old, and so on. And this forces one to really, really understand those concepts. So otherwise, you can't put them into this language. And I would have never been forced to do that if I hadn't made that decision to help a child really make sense of the world. If you put children and their growth at the center, well, that changes things.
I feel how meaningful that relationship is for you, and sacred, and clearly, yeah, a significant guide for you and teacher for you. And I think reminder in this conversation that, you know, here we are as a bunch of adults getting so smart with our theories, and yet there's something really simple around. It's like what I think it was Buckminster Fuller said, that, you know, children are our ancestors in universe time.
Mm-hmm.
And to connect with that wisdom that's here to inherit whatever's coming next, and not see them as kids, but see them as instruments of wisdom and consciousness. Many at a certain age that are kind of they're not traumatized yet, so to speak, right? So they're not so conditioned by concepts, and to somehow like tune into that wisdom, right, as we're like in this design process, and like what is their generation calling in terms of a design and a community and an education system, and really actually listen.
It comes down to very few principles. The first person in my environment, my world, to become a father was my friend Mark, about more than 20 years ago, and I was like, dude, you're crazy. I could never take that, right? It's impossible. And he said, actually, it's not that difficult. All you're doing is you're helping a new human understand how we do things around here. And if you take that and then use that as an opportunity to maybe reinvent the things we do around here because they don't make sense anymore, you have that natural cycle. And then, as you say, you don't turn. You're not racist against younger humans by calling them children, right? They're just humans with less experience in this world, which is actually a benefit, and you don't own them, right? This is another piece of the language that that I did see very often, where especially with families like ours, where the child moves between two parents. Often I hear people say, "Oh, I have the children on this and that day."
Yeah.
Well, you don't have them ever, right? They are with you, right? And that's and this having comes with so much burden. It's like you one part of it is ownership, the other part is yes, the responsibility that you obviously have. But it is a much more burdened responsibility than saying, we're spending the day together, he's with me. And just changing these little tiny little pieces of your thinking and your language changes a lot of your concepts.
And I think what we are into here is something fundamental when we talk about wisdom, because what is it that children truly hold? And maybe that's a core wisdom of being a human being, because children should be born into love. And if they're held with love, which children often brings out in us adult people, the ability to truly, truly love. I remember having my first daughter, and I had feelings that I never felt before, and I didn't knew existed about how it was to, like you said earlier when we talked, Thomas, this was a new landscape of responsibility. I didn't know how to do it. I just felt a lot of things that I had never felt before. Holding this child into my body, and that closeness and that connection and that communication at that level. And she really reminded me of what deep, deep, deep love and compassion is. And how simple that is, and holding that truth in our lives is a really, really powerful wisdom, making us remember who we can be truly. And that is basically what is in these first moments with our children. We are seeking harmony, we are seeking deep contact, we are fully, I can even see light around it, so powerful is it. And in that state, I only want to do good to anything and create harmony with everything. And then I can go out of that state and out of that room, and I can forget some pieces of what is really, really important.
What you're touching there is a question, is it really that hard? It's not that hard, right? Actually, it's very simple. And we put layers and layers of complexity and complicatedness around very simple things. And then we have to throw more complicatedness and complexity at those to maintain them. And this is what I don't understand is how can we allow ourselves to go into the opposite direction and break down the complicatedness and complexities, and make it more simple, more beautiful and free again through that. That's it. No?
So I think it's because also when we are doing this, we are becoming part of the paradigm that we've tried to part from, because we are thinking clever thoughts in a position, and there's an entire industry around that called conferences and whatever, and it's a huge, humongous amount of bullshit. And you said it really beautiful the other day in a conversation, Thomas, that we talked about if there was an AI parent, like an intelligence governing everything, and you said yes, it's called economics and capitalism. And you said, what if that AI parent was love instead of what we have now, right?
Yeah.
So I think it's a really powerful place we brought ourselves here. Just remembering who we truly, truly are.
And just the as you were saying earlier, Lars, the simplicity of just fear versus, or love versus fear, just like it's like coming down to those really rudimental principles, and to kind of weave some of this discussion together. I'm just loving how this is landing around kids, because you know, in some native cultures, like the greatest honor is to plant a seed under which shade you'll never sit as it grows into a tree. You know, you're actually the 7-generation approach, right? Is you're just actually in service to the next generations. And as I was saying before, is like, as part of the design criteria is how do you prioritize the common good? Well, perhaps what actually connects all of these, prioritize the common good, have like intrinsic motivation, this like natural capacity to give and nurturing, the capacity for coherence. Perhaps all of this comes together in this community that's around this undeniable shared intention to be existing for the future generations. So it's not about it's not about what they get. It's only about creating the most awesome existence for not just their kids, but their kids' kids. And
but that's the answer to the question. So you have the 100 people, and then you say, okay, now make kids.
exactly. And then, but to the nuance that you were bringing in is there is a certain parenting programming that supports a relation with the kids where the kids are actually the teachers, the guides, they're so often as parents, it's like the kids in service to you, or they're like inconvenience, or you have the kids, as you were saying. But the shift in worldview to see the kids as the gift, as the even elder wisdom, as the one that you're existing to service, and a community in connection to that worldview, I think is a really powerful orienting energy that stays naturally in the heart. Because like you have rational care and action towards supporting your kids than you do to building a cool community. You know, it's like an easier way to tap into that generous, loving action that's so natural to human beings.
I think you just lifted us to the highest level we have had in any of these conversations, and you put it into one sentence, and you said we are actually just in service of the next generation.
And the humility in that too, right? It's like, wow, it's not about anything we accomplish for us or our fame, or it's like just simply the humble seed planters of whatever comes after us.
It resonates. I think I shared it with Thomas. I have an evening meditation where I have an image of lying, dying, and my kids are standing around, and I measure my life into what is happening in them in that moment, whether my life has been worth living. Was the love they needed, and were I truly a person managing living in reality in a way that have inspired them to their lives. And it's not just my kids, but it's basically they're just representative of what it means to have that responsibility. And I had this meditation for many years every night.
Wow.
I mean, that's Lars and I came up with something a while ago we call Tall Talk. That's connects this to a more social, maybe even a cultural, institutional ritual, helpful for people to do this. And a Tall Talk is just a dinner conversation with some tiny little rules. Rule number one is everybody pitches up at the same time. So there's no information asymmetry in the people that are there. Rule number two, you introduce yourself by describing how you want to be seen by your loved ones at the end of your life. And rule number three, no small talk. And it's powerful. It's really powerful. I've had crazy intimate conversations between people that have never met before. Crazy, really. And it's so easy. And everybody has dinner all the time.
Love it. We need more of that in life for sure. Yeah. Especially bringing people together who have different perspectives. You know, I think there's something just magical around people with very different backgrounds and cultures, and finding their shared humanity and shared struggle, and what that does for people.
And it emerges out of vulnerability. So if the first person in this circle makes him or herself really available, this will follow, and that opens a space that we're usually not used to. But through like a more probably than a year inquiry, I followed a couple of years back to try and understand what the ultimate difference between us and machines is. What I concluded was that there's only one difference, and that is vulnerability. So our humanness is tied to vulnerability. Machines always have the capacity to heal themselves in some way if they're hurt. They can roll back to a new, to an old data or software version. They can put on a new arm. We cannot do these things. So that is our inherent humanness, is vulnerability, and tying things back to that is super powerful.
Yeah. Gentlemen, it's getting late for me here, and I haven't eaten anything, but I'm just enjoying the space we're in. It's just such a beautiful space we've created together. And
thank you.
Closing thought that was coming through, just like an epiphany I'm having, is a teacher once shared with me and said, Andrew, he's like, the bit of a hack, in your conscious evolution is anything that's sacred to you, anything that's like you want to keep or do yourself, just give it away. Just keep giving it away. Just anytime there's any grippiness, just give it away, give it away, give it away, give it to life, give it in service. And as we arrived at this place in our conversation, I'm thinking like, wow, that sometimes the giving it away, my experience of that is like, well, are they a good steward of this? It's like, I'm not sure if they're the right person to give it to, right? But this energy of like, no, just give it to the next generation. Don't even give it on this kind of like this generational plane. Give it in service of something you'll actually never even see fully in your life. Like to be thinking in those longer kind of horizons, and in a way it further supports that just real kind of like natural human capacity to be stewarding the seeds of our children. And so I love where this all went, and thank you, Thomas, for facilitating and just what you do so naturally. You bring these great people together, and I love how much energy you have for these inquiries and connections.
Thank you. The same is true for all of us here. We're all doing the same thing here. Thank you for spending the evening with us, and I hope you find some delicious dinner now. And we will come back. We will think about this. We will review, and then we will come back with some more.
Great. And Thomas, know that I'm in connection with Forrest on getting you guys connected. I think that's going to be really, really meaningful. We're doing a catch up, and then I'll be able to give him more context. And Lars, what a pleasure! What a pleasure to be with you tonight, and just a beautiful soul. No surprise you're hanging with this guy. So yeah,
it's really interesting. Thomas and I were meeting at a dinner, and we just focused in and had one of the most meaningful conversations instantly in the middle of 12, 14 people, and zoomed in for 2 hours and didn't listen to anything else but each other. And it formed a lifelong friendship.
Mm.
And it was so powerful experience that we could go so deep in such a short time and share things for the first time for both of us. Really interesting. And you just meld into that. I really, really hope I'll have the chance to meet you once in this lifetime.
Inshallah, yeah.
We will.
Let's intend on. I think it's inevitable.
Yeah.
There's a great mystery at work that, you know, we're all part of something that's beyond our wildest imaginations, and yeah, let's hope for that.
We're working on it.
Bon
Yeah.
appetit.
Sail over in the ship, maybe.
Yes. Ship. All sorts of beautiful places. Yes.
Yeah. All right,
Okay.
guys. Have a beautiful day.
You too. Ciao.
See you.
So.